Welcome to the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Erik Won, President and Chief Medical Officer of Wave Neuroscience Biotechnology. Now, I met Dr. Erik at Global Special Operations Week. And why was I so interested in the things that he was talking about? If you are someone who struggles with brain fog, energy, depression, PTSD, someone who struggles with traumatic brain injury, as if you've gotten hit in the head or been exposed to things that might jar your brain, and you've tried everything, this episode is for you. It's for anyone and everybody that is suffering with anything related to their brain. I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope you learn as much as I have. As always, this information is free to the public. Please, please take a moment to share it, spread the good word, rate, subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you are interested in information like this to make you the better and best version of yourself, take a moment to go to the website, subscribe to our newsletter. This is free content delivered directly to your inbox without having to do anything. Because remember, friends, together we are forever strong. Dr. Erik Won, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so people should know a little bit about our history. We met at Special Operations Week. It was Global Special Operations Week, and it was really incredible. All the operators from around the world got together. Well, they all didn't get together, but the people, the medicine, the community got together to really move the needle. And you were one of the individuals there.
Yeah. It was very much an honor and privilege to be able to speak there. It was run by an organization called Global Soft. Stu Braden and Keenan Yoho are good friends who are running the operation. But I was able to speak and provide some updates on some of our clinical trials. And of course, the community is very interested in emerging data with traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. So was able to provide an update to the community there.
Yeah. And you're a former Navy. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, especially the listener.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I was a Navy flight surgeon, was attached to a Marine Corps unit, HMM 268, and we deployed as the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit. We had a somewhat unfortunate distinction. We had some of the first casualties of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And as a byproduct of that, I've always been looking for something that could help the men and women that I served with, which is a big part of why I ended up kind of in the organization that I'm with. But I left my military service, finished up my medical training at the Harvard Occupational Medicine program, and ended up at the Boeing Company, where most people know we build planes and satellites, but we have emergency rooms at all of our heavy manufacturing sites. And I took on a different role as their chief technology officer for medical services, which is how I interface with this technology, and was hearing how it could help men and women who are struggling with a variety of conditions, and specifically it was a post-traumatic stress and concussion-type symptoms that really drew me in. So fast forward a few years, I did quite a bit of diligence, joined the company about 8 years ago.
And is this Wave Neuro? The company? Yeah.
Exactly. So it's really been a full sprint ever since.
The war is never pretty for anybody, for the families, the individuals there. And I can only imagine that really impacted your trajectory of how you even thought about medicine.
Yeah, it's hard to articulate the type of impact that can have on the whole community. And, the mission, for me at least, changed quite a bit from one of force readiness and support to how do I help all these men and women, not just in the near term, but long term. Because the conflict was very kinetic, a lot of traumatic brain injuries, a lot of post-traumatic stress, and those tend to be more long-term lingering conditions. And
people might not see them.
That's right. And so it is one of those challenges to try to find clinically meaningful therapeutics that can help people through these issues. And it is one of those things that we learn, that there is this secondary effect to families where both spouses and children can struggle both with not having the service member at home, but also some of the trauma gets shared. And so that's been a big part of our effort as well.
The reason I asked you about that is, we were talking about my husband who is now in his urology residency. He was in the SEAL teams and he was a medic in the teams. I don't know if I told you that. Again, he had been to war and there was a lot of things that he couldn't help with. And that actually saw a lot of lower blast injuries. And there was a lot of just experiences that he wished that he was able to do more with in that moment. And that's why he actually went into urology, or in part, one of the reasons he went into urology.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's where my questions were coming from, because again, he had been a medic at war and there's only so much that can be done. And when you experience that, it seems as if you take that experience and do really good work in the world.
Yeah, it certainly drives a different level of passion. When the motivation is about mission and purpose, you can work long hours, grind through a lot of things and not even think about it. It ends up being kind of a labor of love. And I would say that the science and the evidence around traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress has evolved kind of at an unmatched pace, I would say, over the last decade. And so it's a fascinating time to be in this arena and to see the types of developments that are happening, both from a neuropathologic perspective, but our world when we're talking about electrophysiology and functional brain imaging. There's been a lot of knowledge gained, even year over year, it seems month to month, we're learning new things.
It's so rapid. That's so rapid. And to give people a background, you had told me that you had done environmental and occupational medicine, and then emergency medicine. Found this, then obviously we're a flight surgeon, and found this, as you went back to re-examine what you were doing, you found Wave Neuro, which I'd love for you to explain a little bit about the technology and the treatments and what it is impacting.
Sure. So the basic technology, it's merging three different capabilities. One is a functional neuroimaging technology called quantitative EEG, or electroencephalogram. So much in the same way, an electrocardiogram is an electrophysiologic picture of the heart. These EEGs are electrophysiologic pictures of the brain. And we're specifically looking for disruptions or dysregulations in brain activity and neural networks. And we can identify that. We can, with a fair amount of precision, target those areas and try to restore function to the circuit. And we use another technology that's FDA cleared for depression, but we're using it kind of agnostic to the diagnosis and looking to restore function to a specific circuit, most commonly the default mode network. And when we see that type of function return, we also see concurrent improvement in symptoms. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but to give you an idea, it's about 30 minutes a day, the treatment, and it's usually between 4 and 6 weeks, depending on the severity of the injury that we see. And just to share kind of my first experience with this technology, I was very skeptical, but I had a Marine buddy. He wouldn't mind me mentioning his name, but let's just call him Jay to keep him, medical privacy. But
and basically, because he doesn't want you, he doesn't want people calling him.
But he's a very dear friend. He was really struggling, and it wasn't just him. His friends were calling me saying, "Hey, can we do something?" And
you worried that he was going to commit suicide?
I was, yeah. And he is sort of the classic polytrauma, what the VA calls a polytrauma case. He had post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, and opioid addiction. And the third was a byproduct of a failed back surgery. He had pseudoarthrosis of L4, L5, and chronic pain. And he was on about 170 morphine equivalents per day, which is a very high dose. For the audience that may not be aware, anything more than 100 morphine equivalents per day will double your risk of all-cause mortality in any given year. So that was
through respiratory failure, injury.
It's for a variety of reasons, but respiratory failure is a common reason. But there can be multiple organ issues that happen with chronic opioid use. Even it's very common to see hypogonadism and low testosterone. And so there's multiple issues that happen that can have
opioid use.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's called opioid-induced hypogonadism. And so a lot of these people who are on chronic years of opioid end up requiring, many different medications to manage their symptoms. But, when I met with him, I talked to him, I wanted him to give this treatment a try because it was one of the novel therapeutics that I'd seen
At that time.
at that time.
Because what you're talking about is personalized transmagnetic stimulation, yes?
That's correct.
In part. For the listener, basically what Dr. Erik and I are kind of framing up for you is why and if and, when someone should use things to treat depression, head injury, TBIs, which then manifests in a whole host of ways, including hypogonadism, including depression, including energy fatigue. I mean, you and I share patients together. I send, not only has my husband seen individuals at Wave Neuro, but I have patients that use these kind of protocols, that's how impactful they are. But anyway, at the time, how long ago was that?
This is around the 2015, 2016 timeframe.
Not that long ago, because transmagnetic stimulation, and I know that that's only one of the modalities that you guys use, it wasn't so novel at the time, right?
It was not as well known as it is now. And I think it's become more mainstream and accepted as a non-pharmaceutical intervention that can really help with depression. And I've seen many cases of people who had given up hope. They tried many of these antidepressants and talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and this was the approach that seemed to help them the most. And so I knew that TMS by itself was very promising. And the question became, could you personalize it in a way that could help other populations? And we can take a deeper dive into that, but just to finish the story about my friend,
Jay,
my friend
better
Jay.
Get that name right.
Yeah, so he came in, and I have pictures where he was very disheveled. He looked nothing like the crew chief that I deployed with, decades earlier. And he came in grudgingly. And within the first week, we could see a change because he was showering again. He was going to work out. And at the 2-week mark, his wife sent me a picture and said, I got my husband back.
Oh.
And he shaved, and you could see kind of the life come back into his eyes. And within a month, he had given me a call and said, hey, doc, I'm off my opioids. And my initial reaction, as most medically trained doctors, would be, hey, that's a little dangerous. That's a lot of opioid to come off of in such a short period of time. But he had tapered himself down. And it kind of boggled my mind. Traditional medicine, we don't expect to see these kind of changes in such a short period of time. But I knew this was my friend. He's not going to lie to me. And both him, his spouse, his children were all saying that this was really quite transformative. So I started paying attention. I sent in about a dozen other Marines. And it was a very consistent benefit that we were seeing. And so I still remember the day. There's a Navy SEAL Master Chief. Your husband may know. I won't mention him by name either. But
is he under 5'5"?
He's not. He's not.
Okay.
But yeah, at this point, there was a lot of special operations operators who were coming in. And the organization had asked me to come in as one of the leaders. And I had declined several times. I was just very happy in my role at Boeing. And this the SEAL Master Chief kind of put his finger in my chest and said, what do you stand for, brother? Are you going to do this for the rest of your life, stay at Boeing, or are you going to get in the trenches and help out your brothers and sisters? And really, that resonated with me in a way that I was not anticipating, because this was a different level of mission and purpose. If we can help a vulnerable community, not just patient to patient, but a whole population of people that are struggling with a condition where there are very few effective therapeutic options, that was worthy of a pretty significant career change. And so I spoke to my wife about it, and she agreed. She said, this is all you think about. This is all you talk about.
Why was it that was the thing that caught you? I mean, you saw a lot of different kinds of injuries. Was it that the TBI, what we're talking about specifically, the traumatic brain injury, was it because the treatment seemed to do something? Why was it that caught your attention over, say, something else?
That's a big piece of it, because to this point, there haven't been a lot of therapeutics that were really helping in a meaningful way. And I had spent the prior 15 years trying to help men and women who are struggling with this. And we could see improvements, but this was in a matter of weeks, people having improved cognition, having improved sleep. These were secondary effects of the injuries that we typically didn't see through traditional medical therapeutics. The other part of this that I found really intriguing is it's really the first time in the course of human history where we had the ability to predictably and with some level of precision modulate brain activity in a way that could be helpful. So to me, that was worthy of spending a life trying to advance the science and help these communities that were really struggling. And I could see that both among close friends that I deployed with, but other people who are coming in looking for answers.
It's just it's so meaningful, especially with what you're doing now. When you started the technology or started using the technology, you saw this, with your friend Jay. We talked about one component of it. So it's the EEG. The other component is the transmagnetic stimulation. Is that right? And then there's a third component.
Well, the third component is computational analytics that go into designing the protocol for each individual. And that's what we're trying to get FDA cleared. Right now, we have a lab full of neuroscientists who are customizing protocols to each individual. But to scale that, we have an automated protocol generator that can now do 100,000 EEGs per second. And so if we're talking about being able to administer this treatment to millions of people, and right now the estimate is 150 million cases of post-traumatic stress globally. And I suspect that's an underestimate. Just with Ukraine and Israel, there's growing numbers of trauma every day. And for us, a lot of my perspective as a military doc was about the veteran experience, but I've learned sexual trauma survivors are a much larger population of trauma than what we see in the combat-related arenas. And so...
what do you mean? Can you tell me more? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so women or men who survive sexual trauma are living with PTSD many times. And that can manifest in many different ways. But as we opened up our clinical trial, so the first phase of our FDA clinical trial was sponsored by U.S. Special Operations Command. And the second stage was picked up by Texas A&M with the idea that we needed to open this up to civilians and not just do military cases only. And we saw the largest influx of interest from sexual trauma survivors. And one of the issues that we encountered was that an inclusion-exclusion criteria for the study was that they should not have index trauma. The first trauma should not happen before the age of 16. And sadly, the majority of those sexual trauma cases, the index trauma happened before the age of 16. So they didn't qualify for the study, which is a horrible reflection on society at large. But it was one of those things where as the technology moves forward and progresses, we're learning new communities that we can help. And that has been a population where we've seen fairly significant and promising data. So we're still a year away from being able to unblind that data. But yeah, it was one of those things that was challenging to learn, but PTSD extends far beyond just the veteran and military community.
Thank you to TrueLean for sponsoring this episode of the show. Now, before you fast forward through this ad, let me mention that the reason that we have so many ads is so that you can enjoy this content for free. Take a moment to support the sponsors because that's how we get this content out to you. Now, Everyday Wellness is a product that is amazing, and they have these wellness shots. Basically, the company TrueLean made a wellness shot that I can travel with, that I can bring on the plane, that I can use at the hotel. And here's what it has in it. It has 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, a little cayenne pepper. It has turmeric in it. It has rich phytonutrients. Take a little pack, put in water, tastes delicious. I use it all the time. I use it when I am sleep deprived, when I am traveling, when I need a little extra boost. No caffeine, nothing, just great flavor and an incredible phytonutrient shot. You can get yours. They are not only sponsoring this episode, but in addition, they are offering you 50% off. Go to TrueLean, that's TrueLean.com for 50% off. And again, it's Everyday Wellness. They're wellness shot. And if you are enjoying this episode with Dr. Erik Won, you'll have to understand how important it is to augment your overall health and wellness. Because again, the underlying health and wellness will allow you to stand up against the storm of life. So truelean.com, 50% off. Thank you to Puree for sponsoring this episode of the show. One of the reasons why I always take an omega-3 fatty acid is for overall brain health. Doesn't matter your age. Even my kids take omega-3 fatty acids. Mood, it is wonderful for mood and overall cardiovascular health and inflammation. I am bringing to you Puree O3, which is a high quality, well-tested fish oil. Let me tell you about this. Puree O3 is third-party tested and certified by Clean Label Project. And what it is it makes available the testing results. No contaminants, no heavy metals. These are things that, as a provider, as a mom, I'm very concerned about. I don't want to be giving a supplement that is a concentrated supplement that has a whole bunch of contaminants. Puree O3 is a world-class supplement line and company. I absolutely am thrilled to bring this to you. And by the way, they are offering my audience 20% off. All you have to do is use the code Dr. Lyon for 20% off. Puree Omega-3 fish oil has a high dose of 2,000 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA, in natural triglyceride form. I personally can tell the difference. They also have products that have little packets where you can throw it in your bag. It has vitamin D in it, it has magnesium, no fishy flavor, nothing. It truly is what I think is going to be on the forefront of top products. So support your health, throw it into your regular routine. Go ahead and grab your Puree O3, and that is PUORI.com/Dr. Lyon. That's PUORI.com/Dr. Lyon. So to kind of summarize the Wave Neurotechnology, which is what we're talking about, and actually what we're talking about is overall brain health. And we're going to learn all about how it works, what people are looking for. You and I have gone through cases, and it's just so fascinating the way that someone could potentially process information, where they might be tired or where their brain might be. I don't remember what you called it, but it was somewhat overburdened, or it wasn't, it was very elegant the way that you said it, but essentially it was a non-optimized brain, and that potentially things get a little bit worse before they get better, or it's not just this, trajectory upwards of healing or improvement. But the brain function itself, you talked about traumatic brain injury, which is a physical insult to the brain. Now, you mentioned PTSD, which is a non-physical. It manifests physically, but it's a external stimuli of an event. Both PTSD can come in a number of ways, whether it's sexual trauma or war trauma, any of those things. And then and then depression. So you also mentioned depression as ways in which, non-pharmaceutical ways in which we treat the brain. Are there any other potential subset of groups of things that we're treating? So if the listener is at home thinking, why do I care about what Dr. Erik is talking about? You care because probably, quite frankly, everybody should go through this testing, because you might have hit your head and your brain waves are functioning out of whack, right? But are there other specific domains of people that are listening out there that they should potentially get their brain checked?
Yeah, to your point, I think it's useful for everyone to get an EEG and to see how their brain is doing. Getting a baseline provides a reference point for which, if there is some type of injury that occurs in the future, you at least know, how is my brain functioning back in 2024. But there are other subpopulations that are emerging as potential use cases for the technology. Not just what Wave Neuroscience is doing, but the whole neuromodulation community is looking at, can this be helpful for substance use disorder? I talked about my friend Jay, who was struggling with opioid use. We're seeing some use cases for autism. And to be clear, there's a large amount of research. double-blind RCT is the gold standard of scientific evidence that needs to be done before we can make any kind of claims about this. But I think it's fair to say that we're seeing some early signal that this technology may have some use cases that warrant further investigation and interrogation. And I think when we talk about those different indications, it's worth spending a moment talking about network modeling. And I think that may be the example that you were talking about earlier. And this is, I think, a fairly exciting development in the neuroscience world. And what has emerged is something that's called triple network theory. There's a Stanford professor, his name is Vinod, I may be mispronouncing it, but he proposed this triple network theory where there's sort of three separate circuits that dominate neurocognitive function. And every thought, feeling, and emotion we have is encoded three-dimensionally in time and space. And if we had the same exposure, let's just say we look at a cup of coffee, how that would look in your brain and my brain may be quite different. So there's a lot of complexity to this. We have 89 billion neurons, each that are interconnected to 10,000 other neurons. And how that picture shows up in an image can be very different. But there are certain invariant components to that you can image and see and potentially pick up neuropathology as well. And so the three circuits are called the salience network, that's very closely associated with depression, the default mode network, which is sort of the area that we've been most intensely focused on, and the central executive network, or frontoparietal network it's also called. And these three interplay and have been researched with a really good amount of rigor. And so there's a Stanford researcher by the name of Nolan Williams who looked at an accelerated protocol to treat depression and specifically was targeting the salience network. Our work is very focused on default mode network because dysregulation of the DMN has been strongly correlated to TBI and PTSD.
And before you go further, default mode network, can you define a little bit about what that is? From my understanding, it's kind of the way in which the brain waves run in outside of cognitive control or cognitive thought process. When I was at WashU, there was a man named Marcus Reichel. Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
I think he won the Nobel Prize or something. Something crazy, or was nominated for the Nobel Prize for some of his work on default mode network. And I remember just talking to him because he has like this big brain imaging place there. But could you explain, and that's kind of how I understood it from what he said, but I'm sure that there's another way in which you would.
Yeah, so the DM, we'll call the default mode network DMN, it's your resting state kind of at idle. And a lot of neuroscientists would say that this is the specific network that deals with self-monitoring and self-awareness. And so any type of dysregulation here can manifest in a number of different ways. The important part is that there appears to be a pretty linear relationship between disruption of the DMN and severity of post-traumatic stress. And there's some great work done there's a researcher out of Florida State named Kevin Clancy who has found that if we tune to that and we treat that, we can see improvements in those symptoms as well. And that's part and parcel for our approach. And so this network modeling allows us to take strategic approaches to these treatment protocols. And so I mentioned this Stanford approach. They're treating in a specific area called the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they're trying to tap into a circuit, the salience network. And specifically, if they're able to, they call it anti-correlation, reverse the communication between what's called the subgeniculate anterior cingulate cortex and the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they see remission in depression. So you can actually see this on fMRI.
How long does that take to happen?
And that protocol is just a week.
And you can actually see, so you put someone into an fMRI machine, which is a machine in which you can actually see. How would you describe an fMRI machine?
Yeah, so the difference between an fMRI and a traditional MRI is taken over a time series. And so you can look at function over a period of time. And in this case, pre and post-treatment, you could look at changes between how the brain connectivity is occurring. In
action, kind of,
That's
right?
right.
Is that, but
That's
it's...
Exactly. So it's more of a dynamic type of neuroimage rather than a static still image. EEG is similar. Instead of looking at metabolic activity, it's looking more at electrophysiologic function. And so whereas they're targeting depression in the Salience network, our approach has been to look at the default mode network. So we actually stimulate in a different location, the medial prefrontal cortex. That is what's been most closely associated with post-traumatic stress and TBI. What's interesting is that electrophysiologically, TBI and PTSD look very similar. There are some neuroscientists that would argue it's almost indistinguishable. And so you start to wonder, is PTSD perhaps a secondary byproduct, at least in veterans, of some form of traumatic brain injury? Because we are learning just the training that a lot of service members go through is TBI inducing. And when I talk to these operators and they talk about breaching doors, or even there's two other populations where we've seen significant overpressurization blast exposures. One is artillerymen, and the other is EOD, explosive ordnance disposal.
Yeah.
But
EOD guys have a rough job.
Yeah.
Because they have to practice.
Exactly.
And I know that there's ways in which they try to mitigate exposures.
Yeah.
But
well, yeah, the men and women that we're taking care of, they're taught, you train how you fight. And so the minimum safe distance when you breach a door, they're not always following that because they want to get in, they want to do their jobs. But electrophysiologically, we can see pretty clearly these kind of disruptions. But to bring this full circle, there was some great work done. There's a researcher out of Uniformed Services University, Daniel Pearl, who did autopsies on veterans who had significant blast exposures. And they specifically found areas of the brain where there's disruption. He calls it astroglial interface scarring. And this is where white matter turns into gray matter. And as a blast wave comes to you, it drops its kinetic payload specifically at this junction. And that's where we see the scarring and the disruption. If that rings a bell, if astroglial rings a bell, it's because we've had this new discovery of the glymphatic system that's been associated with brain health, and specifically during the deep stages of sleep. This is the system that washes away the oxidative stress that accumulates throughout the day. And so when that system is disrupted through blast injury or scarring, sleep disruption becomes part and parcel to that. And it is a very common symptom constellation that we see. And so you start seeing, you had Chris Frew on earlier, and he talked about operator syndrome. The commonality to this, our biology doesn't care what the label is.
No.
Right? You can call it PTSD, you can call it TBI, you can call it operator syndrome. But the types of injuries our biology is sustaining, all of these are neurobiological issues. And I think for the patients who come in and see their EEG, it's a very disarming conversation to have, because they now realize, okay, I'm not just a jerk. I'm not just out of control. There's a genuine neurobiological issue that we need to reconcile. And that's where you can really team up and partner and start doing some good work together.
Yeah. So someone comes in, they come into Wave Neuro, they go through this process. What would they expect? What would you expect to see? What are the things that are outcomes and lengths of time?
Sure. So we do 15 to 30 minute EEG. It's an eyes closed resting EEG. And that is processed by our lab. And then there's a conversation usually with one of our doctors or neuroscientists. And we have about 100 different centers now that have been trained and know how to use this type of capability. And then there's a consultation where the physician can tune the TMS device to treat the individual with some optimal parameters. And so that entails a 30-minute treatment daily.
And the optimal parameters, and people don't feel this. This is, right, do they?
You can, so the TMS device does provide a pulsing sensation.
It's a big magnet, right?
It is. It's generally about a 1.8 Tesla coil, but the stimulation itself isn't painful. It's feels like a mild tapping sensation, and it's generally there's different protocols, but between 6 to 10 seconds of pulses, and then there's a period of rest, and then the pulses start again. And so there's a protocol called theta burst that's very short. It can be between 5 to 15 minutes, but standard protocols are usually more around 30 minutes. And that's our protocol as well, although we are researching now in the state of Ohio a 15-minute protocol. So I think that this dialing in of ideal parameters is a work in progress, and there's a number of different ways that we can approach it. But daily, the commitment is roughly 30 minutes a day for about 4 weeks. Some people will go up to 6 to 8 weeks. It sort of depends on how severe the symptoms are. What's interesting is usually people feel some improvement within the first couple of weeks.
In what way? They sleep better?
Usually sleep is the first thing people talk about. And that's intriguing to me is not necessarily quantity of sleep, but the quality of their sleep seems to change. And we've now had a group from the Wounded Warrior Project. This foundation very generously gave us some funding to do work with veterans who came into our San Diego office. And all of them wore these Oura rings. And we could see roughly 25% improvement in deep sleep, which is pretty meaningful. And so that ability to get deeper, more restorative sleep has many, secondary benefits in terms of the ability to, handle stress, resilience, managing information, cognitive function. We also saw improvements in heart rate variability, which were interesting. And HRV, heart rate variability, is something that isn't always talked about necessarily in medical circles, but in functional medicine and especially in kind of human performance, the trainer world, it's become a metric that's very much an area of focus as a proxy for emotional resilience. Mm. So it's interesting to see those kind of changes as well.
Yeah. And when you think about the other things, are there things that an individual, well, first of all, what do you expect to see? And we can talk about that one patient, we won't name him, that we have together, which seemed to have a very striking scan. I don't know how else to describe it, but again, you look at these scans so much more often than I do, but if we were to take that patient from what you remember, how would you describe what you saw initially?
Yeah, there's pretty significant disruption of activity in the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is an area responsible for executive function, organization of thought, and impulse control. And those symptoms were being exhibited by the individual. And really within a few weeks of treatment, subjectively, he was feeling these changes and improvements kind of returning back to normal because he had a pretty significant head injury. And that was corroborated by the changes we were seeing on the EEG as well. Mm-hmm. And so having what we'll call longitudinal biomarker, where you can see and track these changes over time, I think is important for not just the physician, but also the patient to see, because they become their own strongest advocates. And the individual we're talking about is a highly motivated individual who takes great care of himself. But other patients, they may become inspired to be better advocates for themselves. They may have a cleaner diet. They may exercise more. And one of the areas we really enforce is protecting their sleep and using good sleep hygiene.
I hate hearing that. I'm a terrible sleeper because there's just so much to do. And I now hate hearing that. Why sleep? Why would you prioritize sleep over, say, exercise or diet?
I don't know that we have to pick one over the other.
Just trying to make myself feel better.
Yeah. No, I mean, nutrition and exercise are foundational to any sort of regimen, right? Like everyone, if you're going to pick one foundational building block, those two are really high on the list. But recovery and sleep, I think, deserves to be mentioned within that, one of those foundational pillars. And the reason for that is there are many processes that happen during sleep that are important. And one of those, we talked about the glymphatic system. We have the structural scaffolding in our brain, these glial cells, that shrink during our sleep. And we didn't know that until quite recently. There was a researcher at the University of Rochester, Macon Nettergaard, who used 2-photon microscopy, dynamic imaging, to see these glial cells shrink during the deep stages of sleep. And cerebral spinal fluid rushes through those channels and washes away the oxidative stress that accumulates throughout the day. And in a separate study done out of University of Washington, they lumbar punctured, Washington University.
In St. Louis.
Yeah.
That's where I was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They lumbar punctured people after just one night of sleep deprivation. And what they found was an accumulation of proteins that may sound familiar to you and your audience. Exactly. They saw an accumulation of tau protein. Now, that doesn't mean, tau proteins occur naturally.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're phosphorylating and creating these neurofibrillatory tangles per se. But what we learned is it's not just an accumulation issue, there's a clearance issue as well. And so if we're trying to protect our cognitive health, deep restorative sleep should be one of the areas that we're really trying to protect. There's also a stage of sleep, REM sleep, where this is a stage of sleep where a lot of emotional convalescence happens. And so our ability to manage the stresses of the day, a lot of these things we benefit from during these deep restorative stages of sleep.
Are there things that would you see individuals cause backsliding? For example, cannabis use or alcohol. So they're on a great trajectory where you're doing the EEG, you're treating them with a magnet, you're putting them on very specific protocols, you're matching their wavelengths. I know that there are certain brain waves that are active during sleep that are supposed to be slower during waking, and those oftentimes there's a reversal of that in a traumatic brain injury. Is that true?
Yeah. Unfortunately, especially with cannabis being a bit more normalized these days, we do see slowing of brain activity. And I don't want to be kind of a preachy guy or anything like that, but there should be some awareness that both alcohol and cannabis, these are compounds that will slow down brain activity. And it's very hard for us to overcome that. So we do see people backslide with regular use of these things.
What does it do when you say slowing brain activity? Would that just be processing speed? Or are there other things that happen? It
is processing speed. And so we reinforce specifically alpha activity of the brain, which is the cycle rate that your brain processes information, generally between 8 and 13 hertz, which means we encode information 8 to 13 times per second.
Mine's more like 7.
No, I'm sure that's not true. But these slower brain waves, kind of 7, between like 4 and 7, we call theta, and then slower than that, we call delta. Those are your sleepy brain waves. And so when you're stage 1, stage 2 sleep, you're generally in theta, and then we move into delta. And with the slower brain waves, we're able to restore our ATP, and people get deeper, more restorative sleep and are refreshed for the next day. Now, during our wakeful hours, you should see mostly alpha, and then beta activity is more of your fast wave activity. That's associated with complex thinking, complex processes, lots of sensory inputs. But you will see in the wakeful hours, people who use alcohol and cannabis excessively, more theta activity than we want to. And so that's where we talk about the slowing of the activity. They may feel like they're in a bit of a fog, and that's what we're trying to prevent.
If an individual were to remove that without treatment from additional stimuli from the magnet, so you remove the alcohol, you remove the cannabis, do their brainwaves return to normal, or there's no other way to flip the switch than transmagnetic stimulation, right? The body doesn't naturally go back to a normal rhythm, does it?
So there's a lot of variables involved, and so the quick answer, it depends on somebody's age, neuroplasticity, and what are the other behaviors that are associated with the individual. So if somebody's taking really good care of themselves and they smoke a joint one night, they're probably going to be just fine. If they're heavy smokers over years, the recovery may be slower, or the brain may reorganize in a way, or it's just operating a little bit slower. And so there are many things people can do to optimize brain function. We've touched on some of them. Exercise, very, very few things are as useful to brain function as exercise.
Do you care what kind?
It doesn't matter to me so much what kind. I think, movement is always the key, even, for the elderly population, even just walking is helpful.
We do push-ups before the podcast.
I heard that on your last podcast. We didn't do it today, but maybe
We did push-ups. So
you did.
So I have a really good friend who, she's amazing, and she was a former Secret Service agent. And I said, hey, Evie, should we do push-ups together? And she's like, Gabrielle, you want your guests to be relaxed and be able to be in the flow. You and Matt can do push-ups, but don't you dare rope that guest into it. I was like, okay, you're right.
That's impressive. Yeah, so I try not to be too prescriptive in terms of saying, HIIT exercise is the best, or I know resistance training is one.
But I think intensity matters. I think, when it comes to blood flow and, there seems to be different metabolic changes, just looking at Martin Gabala's work. And I think maybe intensity matters, but anything is better than nothing.
Yeah. You did remind me of one of the things where we had sort of clicked at Soft Week based on a discussion. This was George Brooks's work at UC Berkeley, where he was there's a neuroscientist who spent quite a bit of his career studying the lactate shuttle. And so if there was any question about whether exercise helps brain function, we can dispel that notion. There's a clear correlation. And what they found is that, growing up, we always associated lactate and lactic acid as a negative byproduct of exercise. We get sore muscles. But it turns out lactate is a preferred fuel for the brain. And this lactate shuttle specifically, not only is it providing fuel for the brain, but it's also increasing the amount of vascular endothelial growth factor. So it's increasing vascularity through the blood-brain barrier, something we call VEGF, which also increases the amount of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a proxy for neuroplasticity. And so we're learning at a cellular level how exercise can improve and upregulate brain function. Mm-hmm. So, and to develop lactate, to your point, the intensity actually matters quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that's fascinating. I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because we think about exercise as medicine. There are lots of things that someone could do that wouldn't be good for their brain, like stacking drinking and no sleep and smoking a lot of pot and not exercising. But the thing, that sounds like a terrible, don't do that. But the things that we can do that really make an impact are working really hard physically to the point where you're producing lactate and allowing that to be fuel for the brain, choosing a really good healthy diet, sleeping, which I'm guilty that I know I need to. But again, I have 2 little kids. They like to come and wake us up a million times a night. Just might not be a realistic thing. But when you think about improving individuals' cognitive function, that's part of it. When my husband went, and by the way, so he didn't have any, I'm sure he had blast injuries. There's just because breaching and doing all that stuff. And, even micro injuries, when you shoot guns, there's like micro trauma that happens. One of the things that they had told him was to be very particular about sunlight, was to be very particular about being outside, something about melatonin, something about blue light. I don't know if any of that has changed. This was a couple of years ago when he got treated. Are there certain other things that you recommend for patients and brain health?
Yes, I love that you brought that up, because there were 2 Nobel Prizes awarded for the discovery of blue light. And
were you one of them?
No, I wish. No,
As a matter of fact, yes.
I wasn't privileged enough to be part of that team, but blue light specifically is 450 to 500 nanometer light. It's richest in morning sunlight. And this is our first biological cue to start our circadian rhythm. And so the advice is to be outside sometime during your first waking hours, and to get natural, unfiltered blue light into your eyes. And when you do that, there's a specific receptor in your eye called the melanopsin that sends a signal.
We just learned about this yesterday, by the way.
Yeah. So it sends a signal to your suprachiasmatic nucleus that will tell your pineal gland to release melatonin roughly 14 to 16 hours later. So the second part of that is you have to listen to your biology. And at the first sign of nighttime somnolence, usually between 9 and 10 p.m., you do actually have to get into bed. Because when your melatonin spikes, there's a short window And if you fall asleep at that time, you'll get very deep restorative sleep.
That's amazing. And if you miss that window,
You may stay up quite a bit.
now that all makes sense. Matt, does that happen to you? That happens to me all the time. So basically, I get really tired. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, I just got to read this one more article, just this one more thing.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, I'm up, even though I fight it so hard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Matthew Walker, he's sort of one of these podcast heroes that every time I listen to him, like, that guy's really good. But he has mentioned that we're the only species in nature that voluntarily deprives itself of sleep. And it is usually the overachiever that's doing that. And so I'm guilty of it as anyone. So to the degree possible, yeah, we have to be vigilant to it and try to get ourselves to sleep.
You're absolutely right. So I think that before I kind of got down the path of brain function, brain waves flipping backwards, the reason I brought that up is because my husband, there was no way, I don't think that, so basically when he did his scan, he was awake, but his brain waves looked as if he was asleep. It was almost as if they had flip-flopped. I don't think that there would be any way for him to fix that or redirect that naturally without some kind of electrical impulse. Would that be fair to say that this may be, that eventually this EEG of the brain, this treatment of the brain would be as common as going for your annual physical and getting an EKG?
Yeah, so each case is individual. Your husband was in a pretty kinetic environment. And so I don't want to speak in absolutes because it's hard to predict what may or may not have happened. But brain stimulation certainly allows people a quicker path to recovery. And if we were seeing theta and delta waves in the prefrontal cortex, that is specifically a scenario that we do very well with. And it is a really common pattern in our operators. In general, what we've noticed among this cohort, speaking specifically of service doesn't matter. It can be an Army Delta, Green Beret, Air Force pararescue.
Get those berets out of here. I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. I'm a Navy wife.
The first thing we observe is they're very fast brains. They're very fast processors. They could be, many of them have the profile of an Olympic athlete.
Don't tell them that.
But we also see the similar signature where they're slowing in the prefrontal cortex. And I suspect some of that is they're in an environment, they go overseas. They're in a combat environment where they have to be hypervigilant. They're usually operating at night because they have the tactical advantage of night vision goggles, 18 time zones away. It is a circadian rhythm nightmare.
I did not know that because of the night vision, or just because they're awake when they should be asleep and we're not nocturnal. Would that be the reason why?
Yeah, they, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, the enemy didn't have, NOGs and NVGs, and so a lot of the operations happened at night.
Yeah, and Shane and my husband was in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and so you take 6 months to a year of that kind of environment, night after night after night, many times multiple missions a night, and you ask them to come back home. It's hard to get back into a circadian rhythm. And many times without the knowledge of getting blue light in the morning, our biology takes a little while to catch up. And given enough repetition and chronicity of that type of environment, there's reorganization of brain activity that's hard to move back. Now,
not in a positive way, is what you're saying, that there's a reorganization. It's almost as if you get an injury, a tendon injury, and the collagen lays down, cross-linked in a way that it shouldn't.
That's right. Yeah. Now, the happy part of that story is God or Mother Nature, depending on whether you believe in God. We've been engineered to be healing organisms. And if we give the brain a friendly reminder and a stimulus that you want to be operating at this speed, the body does most of the heavy lifting for us. We don't have to overpower the brain with lots of energy, although electroconvulsive therapy is a modality, and I don't diminish the value of it. I think it's incredibly valuable for certain populations.
Sorry to interrupt you. So that's ECT, electroconvulsive therapy.
Yeah.
Which is, you guys don't do that, or you do?
We don't do that.
Okay, so that's typically what you guys are thinking is, was it One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Clockwork Orange or something where it is exactly what it sounds like, but that's not what it is. It seems as if ECT would be scary and shocking. It's electrocurrent therapy, like shock therapy, but it's not kind of how it's been portrayed.
That's right.
And not really often used anymore. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of turn for the psychiatrists out there, but when I trained in psychiatry, so I trained at the University of Louisville in psychiatry for 2 years, and out of all of the patients that we saw, I think maybe only 1 or 2 in 2 years was a candidate for ECT, which was really depression that was absolutely resistant to every kind of medication.
Yeah. Well, that is a population where ECT, is pretty effective.
Mm-hmm.
And while, I don't like the one flew over the cuckoo's nest.
Was that, yeah.
But that is the move. That is the procedure that they describe in the movie. But these days, it's a fairly safe and fairly effective procedure. And so I don't want to diminish the value of that. I've had the privilege of working with numerous academic psychiatrists, and it definitely has its place.
Definitely.
And there are patient populations who are served well by ECT. What we're doing is much lower energy. Right. And, you don't require any anesthesia or anything like that.
No anesthesia. People are awake. They stay awake. Maybe they get sleepy.
That's right. It's very mild. But that gentle stimulation, you just need a little nudge, and then the brain and our biology takes care of most of the work for us.
Do you want to know what I drink in the morning that is a little bit salty and gives me a huge pick-me-up? Well, I'm going to tell you. And that is chocolate element, that's LMNT, in my coffee. I brew a black cup of coffee with a shot of espresso, and then I put a scoop of collagen and a little bit of MCT oil in it, and 1/4 a packet of Element chocolate. Sometimes I use chocolate mint. I've also saved chocolate caramel. It's kind of this like chocolatey caramel. Amazing. So I get my caffeine, I get some collagen for, of course, hair, skin, and nails, and I get electrolytes in my coffee. Sodium, potassium, magnesium, all amazing. I have now created my own supercharged drink, which you can too. And by the way, this is a different way to take Element. That's a little packet of electrolytes. If you get headaches, maybe you get headaches with your caffeine because you dehydrate yourself, or maybe you get headaches because you sweat a lot while training, or maybe you just live in Texas where it's hot. And so you definitely sweat a lot. You definitely get headaches. And this is why I love to add electrolytes to what I'm drinking. And it can be coffee, it can be water. Lately, it's been coffee, and it tastes amazing. You can get yours at Drink Element. That's drinklmnt.com. You'll get a free sample pack when you use the code Dr. Lyon. And by the way, if you don't like it, it's totally risk-free. You'll get your money back, no questions asked. I love this stuff. You will too. This episode is brought to you by Timeline Nutrition. MitoPure, the product that I wish I had developed but didn't. So I've teamed up with Timeline Nutrition to bring you one of my ultimate favorite products, and that's MitoPure. MitoPure is a science-backed urolithin A. Urolithin A sounds like a species of something or other. What it is, it's a postbiotic, and 30 to 40% of you humans cannot make it. Why is it important? It's important because it's one of the first gut-muscle access connection. MitoPure helps the muscle and all mitochondria when you take it. You can take it in pill form. You can take it in powder form. I recommend trying the starter kit. They have ginger and berry. I put some in my yogurt. It's amazing. Here's what it does for you. It will improve potentially your energy, your strength, your endurance. Again, MitoPure helps with mitochondria, hence the name MitoPure. It helps with the regeneration and cleaning out old mitochondria. And if you remember anything about, 5th grade science, mitochondria, they are the powerhouse of the cell. So you have to have good mitochondria to have good energy. And one of the hallmarks of aging is a decline in this mitochondria. So if it sounds like you need more energy, more strength, more endurance, and something that tastes great, MitoPure is a way to go. Go to timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon. That's timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon, and you'll get 10% off your first order. I recommend either the starter pack or the pills. Try it. I know that you're going to feel great. Have you done your blood work? If you haven't, I have a solution for you, and that is one of the sponsors of the show, Inside Tracker. Why is blood work so important? Well, you know, I use Inside Tracker. My friends use Inside Tracker. Also, my parents use Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker makes getting blood work very easy and user-friendly. They have an amazing interface. You can check it out on your phone. You can check it out on the desktop, which, you know, hopefully you're using a small one. Inside Tracker allows you to look at really important biomarkers like hormones, iron, thyroid, insulin. The list goes on. ApoB. It never stops. And by the way, if you are a professional and you have clients, Inside Tracker also has a pro platform. Amazing. I really feel that Inside Tracker has revolutionized healthcare. And listen, blood work can be expensive, but it doesn't have to be. Inside Tracker is offering my listeners 10% off anything on the store, in the store, anything as it relates to subscriptions, 10% off. Go to insidetracker.com, like inside tracking your body. Use the code Dr. Lyon, and do not wait. If you are due for your blood work, give this a shot. It's extremely valuable. Back to the show. What do we know about children? What do we know about children and hyperactivity? What do we know about children and autism? And again, whether it's Wave Neuro or these technologies, because Wave Neuro, what makes Wave Neuro so unique. And by the way, I am so grateful for what you guys did for my husband. Thank you. And what you guys do for so many others out there. I think that it's really tremendous. And the thing that makes you guys unique is that you use EEG. So you use the electricity, the electrocurrent imaging. I don't know how else you would say that, with the transmagnetic stimulation, with the program that then creates a protocol to implement. Did I get that all right?
Yeah, that's impressive.
Okay. And so I've seen it work well. I've seen it work for my husband. I've seen it work for my patients. And it makes me think about children, because we know that probably a lot of also hyperactivity originates in the brain. Again, I'm not a pediatric or child specialist. What would you say to that? And are there any trials for brain function in children?
Yeah. Well, so first, I should mention it's very much our honor and privilege to take care of military service members, and especially folks like your husband who sacrifice so much for the country. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. And I think our whole organization rallies around the community. Specific to kids, it's not as well researched. We're still learning. A lot of the science has a ways to go, but there are large population-sized studies with n in the thousands of autistic spectrum children where we can see slowed and delayed development of the prefrontal cortex. And these are not our studies. They're studies. Yale has one of the largest databases where we can see, and perhaps not coincidentally, it's a default mode network that develops that is dysregulated in many of the autistic children. Interestingly, just because there's an article published within the last week, gut microbiome dysregulation seems to be an issue in autistic development as well. And so there's so much heterogeneity in this population. I don't think, at least for speaking for myself, I can't speak from any position of great knowledge. I think we're learning every day. But that specific issue of an electrophysiologic disruption seems to be pretty clear. And they're even listing sensitivities and specificities for ASD in the 80 to 90 percentile using EEG. So I think in the future, it may be, I don't know that it'll be a diagnostic tool, but I think it can be a clinical support study where if children are exhibiting these behaviors and we see these EEG changes, that may help lead us down the path of having a more accurate diagnosis.
Do you, or have they done studies where they anticipate improvement in certain symptoms, or even not even with autism, but with hyperactivity? Yeah,
so the studies, so we would like to do a large double-blind RCT on autism. We do have a group in Australia who has done 2 studies. One that's been published where they look at, it's an open label study. They don't have a sham placebo, but in these children, they noticed clinically significant changes in social behaviors. meaning they were making more eye contact, their vocabulary increased. And many of the changes that we hear from the parents and we see in the children are difficult to quantify and measure scientifically. That's been part of the challenge in terms of putting together a methodologically rigorous study that would pass with the FDA. There's no universal scale or metric that has been declared. So we were using something called the CAR score. There's also an ADOS score. There's a number of different metrics that we can use. But that's one of the first issues that we need to be able to tackle before we invest. These trials cost millions of dollars. And so to be thoughtful stewards of any kind of funding that we receive, we'd want to ensure that on the back end of such a trial, that we would have good data that would convince the scientific community that this is a both safe and effective therapeutic. So that is something we're aspiring to do, but we have some early pilot studies that are giving us some promising data.
And that's reasonable. You want to make sure that the money that you're spending that from funding is used well. This might be another hard question, because again, this is very difficult to control, but have you had anyone go through this process on a ketogenic diet or some kind of diet or take beta hydroxybutyrate or something or a neurotropic that we would believe or know, depending on what the literature is, depending on the input, show improvements?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't think we document that specific type of diet, but yes, we've had a number of, and it's interesting because I can specifically remember the cases. We did have a cohort of SEALs come through, and 3 of them were on a ketogenic diet. And they were specifically on that diet for purposes of some of the neuroprotective qualities a ketogenic diet confers. And they had great responses to treatment.
I wonder if they had better responses than another individual, but it would be so hard to measure.
Yeah, it's hard to parse out what contribution the diet would make, but it does make sense that they would have some advantage in terms of the treatment being more beneficial.
Yeah. What is new? I mean, I totally agree with that, and it would be so fascinating to see eventually if maybe there has to be some synergistic effect.
Yeah.
Because the ketogenic diet, which is 70% fat, was used for the treatment of seizures in children.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some kind of crossover. A few more questions. Are there any nutrients that you guys feel seem to really support treatment, whether it's phosphatidylcholine or any kind of dietary nutrient?
That's a great question. We haven't asked for supplementation with any type of dietary nutrient per se. There is a segment of the population, it's very controversial, this MTHFR mutation. There have been some families who have let us know that when they supplemented an autistic child with methylfolate, they saw a better response. I've spoken to some researchers, both at UPenn and at Children's Hospital LA, who are skeptical about the clinical validity of MTHFR. It's kind of, I think, a space that's the evidence is just starting to come in. And so I can't say with any strong scientific evidence that would be something I'd recommend to other populations. But it was, when we talk about supplements, that's one of the first that comes to mind. One of the areas that I think is worth mentioning, and it's not a supplement, it's actually a DEA tract medication, but we had a couple of operators who did not respond to treatment. And they were some of the first that we saw not have any kind of response. And the commonality between these two was that they had very low testosterone. And so one of the secondary effects of blast injuries and TBI is neuroendocrine disruption. And it's very common to see not just really low testosterone, sometimes zero. And when they went out and got supplemented and came back after having a stable dose of TRT, they had great responses to treatment. And so it seems that there does need to be some degree of hormone balance that lends itself towards having a more effective response to treatment.
That's fascinating. Any thoughts as to why?
Well, yeah, I mean, the physiology of it, especially in men, this is it's sort of a critical hormone to have. And you think about all the biological pathways it impacts, and especially in terms of cognitive function and brain function, we need to have at least some amount of circulating and free testosterone. And so when you restore that system, it makes sense that we would see a better response to treatment. And you could see as well, those were people who were struggling with motivation and, all the different things associated with, testosterone replacement therapy they would benefit from. So that has kind of led to, there's a group called the Special Operations Care Fund, SOCF, and Tomahawk Charitable Solutions was another nonprofit that contributed to something we're calling the Trifecta Study. And so Brandon Weiss, he's a researcher out of Johns Hopkins University, designed a study where they're first getting testosterone replacement therapy. Then they're going down to Mexico. This is Marcus Capone's group vets. They're getting ibogaine therapy, which is a psychedelic. And then they're coming to San Diego to get our treatment. And so that's the trifecta with the conceptual framework of first balancing the neuroendocrine system. Then ibogaine is allowing for neuroplasticity, and then our treatment is riding on top of it and reinforcing alpha and DMN restoration. And the feedback that we've gotten thus far has been not that 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. They feel that this is so synergistic. We're hearing 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. And we're still blind to the results. I can't share that data yet. But,
I'm excited to hear it.
But I think that's where the future is going, is different protocols and stacked therapies. If we're truly in this to help these communities, no treatment works in isolation. And there may be different regimens that help, these populations recover faster and better.
Has there been any pushback, any criticisms of the technology, the protocols, the things that you guys are putting together? Again, I mean, medicine is interesting. It's a science of uncertainty. People think that, medical science is certain. It's a challenge. It's human body, just as you've been saying, is incredibly complex.
That's a great question. I remember I attended a talk at the Salk Institute in San Diego, and they said you can always find the innovators and pioneers. They're the ones with arrows in their back.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, the neuroscience community, psychiatrists, neurologists have all very warmly embraced the approach. And I think anytime we're working together collaboratively to advance the science, it's been a very kind of warm environment to work with. And there's a lot of good information sharing. I would say largely it's been positive. We may encounter naysayers here and there. I think that's part of the process. But largely I would say I've been blown away by the collaborative environment and how this community, whether it's academic, clinical, or commercial, is working together to try to find answers for the community and work together to advance the evidence base and the science.
Well, I love the work that you're doing. What is on the forefront for you guys?
Well, the first thing is we'd really like to complete this FDA trial. And we're currently enrolling in Plano, Texas, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Columbus, Ohio. We're about to open in Seattle and Costa Mesa.
So are you still recruiting for those spots?
We are still recruiting.
All right, go ahead. Give us the spiel. Knock it out.
Yeah, you can include it in the show notes. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to share.
Okay.
There are rules that govern.
I see.
Sort of
But
what we can say.
If they're interested in being part of the study, should they?
Yeah, there is a link that they
go?
can go to enroll in the study. There is a second FDA trial happening in Dayton, Ohio, that is sponsored by the state of Ohio. I should mention that there were legislators in the state of Ohio, Senator Hoagland, and Doc Johnson, who is himself an Air Force veteran who sponsored our treatment for any veteran or first responder in the state of Ohio. So part of that was to conduct an FDA-grade clinical trial as well. We just finished phase 1 of that, which was a safety study. And we're embarking on stage 2, which will be the double-blind RCT. So we'll have 2 separate studies that are ongoing.
It's incredible. And people can find you, well, not find you, but find Wave Neuro. At Wave Neuro, we'll include all of the links. And is there anything else that you wanted to share with the listeners or the viewers?
I guess the closing message would just be that there's never been a greater time for hope. If there are people struggling with any variety of mental health conditions, neurologic conditions, there's so much exciting research happening, innovation in this area, that there is valid and incredible reason for them to have hope, that in our lifetimes we'll see really meaningful breakthroughs in this area. So I hope that they will be encouraged to keep fighting for their health. And if we can be of any benefit, yes, please reach out through our website, or I'll include my email.
No, you will not. No, friends, we will not. But yes. Anyway, you are doing an incredible job helping, and we'll put everything there so that they can find out more. If they have any questions, they can ask our team, and we'll get them over to you. If they are military veterans, where do they go?
There's a Wave Neuro landing page for veterans as well, and so the treatment is covered by TRICARE, and so we can fund through that mechanism. But I know most of our clinics welcome veterans.
And then, if someone is listening to this and they are a civilian, can they come and find out about their brain, learn how to get their brain better?
Yes, of course. Yeah, most of our centers will just do EEGs for information and educational purposes as well.
And if they want a treatment, they could also get that there.
Yes, absolutely.
Amazing. Dr. Erik Won, thank you so much for coming on. We could have gone for another probably hour and a half, but once your trials come out and all of that stuff, I would love to have you back and we can chat all about it.
Absolutely. That'd be great.